Hi, today I'm going to talk about Kathy Change, and I would like to start with a little bit of background. Kathy Change was born Kathleen Chun in Springfield, Ohio in 1950. Her family moved to the Bronx when she was just two. She grew up feeling stared at, giggled at for being Chinese. Her father, Sheldon Chan, was an engineer who also served as a professor at the State University of New York at Stony Brook before retiring in 1980. Her mother, Gertrude, was a writer. I grew up a really lonely girl, Jane said on the Penn student radio show Penn Talk in 1995. Kathy's parents divorced when she was in her early teens. Gertrude and her daughter fought almost every night. It was so wretched, so I thought, well, I'm just going to kill myself, Change said. But as she remembered nearly 3 decades later, she flopped it, only slicing out the tendons in her wrists instead. Neither her scars nor her reputation for hysterics would ever go away. Shortly thereafter, Kathy found her mother dead when she tried to wake her up the morning after they had a fight. Only a well of tears in the hollow by the bridge of her mother's nose remained to show Kathy that Gertrude had been hurting as badly as her daughter did. Her mother's death was ruled a suicide by overdose. Kathy felt responsible for the rest of her life, and Gertrude had succeeded where her daughter had flopped. She did it successfully, so I thought, boy, she really showed me up, Change said. But I didn't have to answer to anybody after that. The next few years were a whirlwind. Kathy flunked out of Mills College in Oakland, California, the only school that had accepted her after just 5 months. For another 6 months, she lived with her grandparents and went back to school at NYU thanks to connection through her parents, and later she met Frank Chin in Chinatown. Considered one of the pioneers of Asian American theater, Chin founded the Asian American Theater Workshop in 1973. Kathy was attracted to what she perceived to be Chin's radicalism, and the two struck up a relationship. Eventually, I said, "Why don't you marry me?" Chin remembered, and Chin said, all right. And so in 1971 he did, taking Change back to San Francisco with him. Change participated in the Asian American Theater Workshop during their marriage, and in 1976 she even published a children's book that was called The Iron Moon Hunter. That same year, though, her marriage ended, and Kathy sank into despair again. The failure of her marriage resulted in another suicide attempt, this time with pills and a fifth of Canadian whiskey. By the fall of 1978, Kathleen Chan needed change so much that she became it. She started going by Kathy Change to reflect her newfound belief that she was going to change the world. After stays in New York and Berkeley, Change moved to Philadelphia in 1981. The late 80s and early 90s in West Philly, outside the Jules Strombox of Penn, was full of folks like Kathy, said Joseph Shahadi, Change's former neighbor, who went on to earn a PhD in performance studies at NYU in 2011 and wrote the essay that all of us read, Burn the Radical Disappearance of Kathy Change. Artists and activists lived in the dilapidated old Victorians and warehouse squats. We went to hardcore shows, shopped at Co-op, ate cheap Ethiopian food, and went to the same half-dozen bars. On October 22nd, 1996, at 11:15 a.m., Kathy Change stood in front of the peace symbol sculpture, dosed herself in gasoline, and set herself on fire. As she ignited, a rope of fire shot up 10 feet into the air. Approximately 50 bystanders, including several students in nearby Van Pelt Library in Penn State University, looked on as change began to dance. Penn police officer Bill Daly ran towards the fire, not even realizing that a person was burning until he came closer. Daly and bystander cover changed in his patrol jacket and rolled her on the ground to smother the flames. She was taken to the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, where she was pronounced dead at 11:48 a.m. with burns over 100% of her body. She tried loudly and visibly enough that almost everyone at Penn knew who she was. Day after day, for a decade and a half, she made a scene on College Green. She danced non-stop for hours on end. She waved enormous homemade flags featuring political messages that warned of imminent economic collapse and nuclear holocaust. She screamed through a megaphone at students passing by. Change was dancing dressed completely in black with a pointed cone above her head to signify that she was a missile protesting nuclear proliferation. Sometimes she'd carry a dollar sign around the campus to warn imminent financial crisis. Often she'd don large bird wings and a mask along with spangled panties and high heels. On other days, she dressed up in a costume that she simply called Satan's dick. But the message wasn't getting through. Penn students may have changed with each passing year, but their rejection of her didn't change. Change had only one hope left. In a letter known as her final statement, Change wrote, "Primarily, I want to get publicity in order to draw attention to my proposal for immediate social transformation. To do this, I plan to end my own life. The attention of the media is only caught by acts of violence. My moral principles prevent me from doing harm to anyone else or their property, so I must perform this act of violence against myself." But for whom, you might ask? A Pence community that routinely ignored her? People will see her around almost every week, doing the dancing and singing and declaring her own poems all the time, day in and day out, but people didn't pay her too much mind. Can protest self-burning be considered suicide if death is, in Kathy's case, only a means rather than a complete end? Can it be considered an altruistic action or pure egoistic desire to show that she was right and others were wrong? In itself, the phrase suicide protest in no way dismisses the altruistic motivation behind the acts, and thus altruism remains implicit in the terms. It accentuates the demonstrative character of the incident, and the subject wished to challenge the status quo and repudiate that which is considered unacceptable. Furthermore, the phrase stresses protest rather than the methods used to express it. Joseph Shahadi keenly pointed in his essay that altruism implies a high degree of relatedness to society, while often enough fiery suicide protests are performed by alienated outcasts whose sacrifice is the final exemplification of their outsider status. Pushing the matter further, Shahadi asked rhetorically, is it possible to commit an altruistic suicide without the implicit agreement, consent, and/or encouragement of your community, and suggested that we call those demonstrative acts of self-annihilation which accentuate the performer's stance on supra-individual issues, performatic suicides. In this view, they differ both from altruistic suicide and egoistic self-destructions motivated by personal problems, even though they incorporate some distinctive features of both. Like the former, they are performed in service to a cause, but differ in that they grant agency to individuals, allowing them much greater influence over the collective. On the other hand, unlike egoistic suicides, which are typically committed in detachment from social fabric, they carry with them the potential to disrupt the social equilibrium and the flow of collective energy in the public sphere. A closer look, however, reveals a trace of egoism underlying the concept of performatic suicide, as the act presumes the imposition of will and a specific perception of reality upon a group. In my opinion, however, although Shahadi's observations have merit, the performative aspect is implicit in the phrase suicide protest itself and does not warrant any further qualification. In my opinion, protest self-burning ignite artists' imaginations. This is in itself not surprising since self-burning stand as a proof of uncompromising nature of human beings, which is embodied here by the capability to sacrifice their life to amplify the expression of their grievances, dissensions, and objections. Art as an exemplary space wherein new solutions can be sought, the status quo rejected and transformed, and radicalism and rebellion cultivated, willingly confronts examples of borderline actions. After all, art itself also it probes, pushes, renegotiates limits, edges, and extremes. In Death as in Life, Change imposed herself on an unwelcoming audience, and yet, in Death, her legacy burns brighter than it ever did before she set herself ablaze. At the root of Change's cause was the Transformation Party, an affiliation she created advocating a community-based democracy and a cooperative barter economy. The dollar was dying, Change insisted to anyone who'd listen, and the economic status quo in America was about to follow. Ludmila Zamak, the former student in Penn, stated that change was pointing out ills in our society before her time, like the economic collapse in 2008. Plenty of left-leaning Americans would think a lot of Change's political idea. She left the Philadelphia branch of the Green Party in 1989 after it refused to include legalization of marijuana in its platform, even though nearly all of its members privately favored the legalization. She criticized U.S. anti-protectionist free trade policies enabling job outsourcing. She denounced President Clinton for enforcing unreasonable no-fly zones in Iraq and warned the United States instigated war with Iraq was imminent. Desperate or not, Change's engagement with the issues was concrete. After all, if you knew there was a peace activist who foresaw the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq, predicted variations of the economic collapse in 2018, refused to back down from advocating marijuana legalization, and touted environmentalism, you wouldn't call her crazy. She self-immolated with one final hope of inspiring reform, but the sight of her fiery exit immediately reverted back to a sphere of leisure. Nevertheless, Change's admirers have continued to keep her memory alive through many different forms of art and media, revealing how precarious her legacy is and how vital it is. Once she transformed herself from Kathleen Chan to Kathy Change, her life was non-stop performance. Her body and mind were constantly on display to challenge the status quo, but but it's telling that what resonated most with few who listened, even more than the content of Change's ideas, it was the conviction behind them. Her cause may have died with her, but inalienable image of change creatively demanding transformation remains. Change's legacy remains precarious because it hinges on few most dedicated admirers continuing to share and discuss her works, but although it takes two for things to pass on, it only takes one to start the process. Apathy kills legacy, and fortunately for Change's legacy and those who choose to hold a stake in it, apathy is what she spent her entire life fighting against. That's it. Thank you.